Today, many people hate on the PS5. They say it was better before, games had more soul, online was free, and consoles lasted forever. And you hear this phrase more and more, the PS3, now that was the gold standard. But is this really true? Was the PlayStation 3 the perfect machine of its time? Or are we just caught up in nostalgia? Though actually, the PS3 and PS5 are pretty similar in many ways. Huge promises at launch about revolutionary tech, high prices compared to Xbox, and even games coming out at the end of the generation. But everyone loves the PS3, while the PS5 gets hate lately. So I suggest we dive into the depths of 7th generation history today, remembering how the PS3 actually felt throughout its entire life cycle. Let's remember the highs and lows, how Sony almost went bankrupt but still managed to ride triumphantly into the sunset. Let's recall the period when internet on consoles was just becoming normal instead of an exception, and how it changed the industry forever. And no, this isn't a PS3 review in 2025. This is exactly what the console faced after launch and how it gained cult status. Though if you want a review, we can do that too. Basically, this is a PS3 retrospective. Let's go. The PS3 story is really complicated, but people love these kinds of plots where failure suddenly turns into phenomenal success. Though the path to that was really rough, they showed the console to the public in 2005. Can't believe it's been 20 years already. And no, I'm not sad about that. I'm sad because the company apparently doesn't learn from its mistakes at all. That presentation lasted a whole 2 hours and wasn't about games, but about their brand new cell processor, which would play its own role later. Meanwhile, remember how they presented the PS5, where they told us about the new revolution with fast memory and SSD, while everyone who wanted to had already installed an SSD drive on their PS4 to speed up loading times. And paradoxically, it worked. Yes, the PS5 has an even faster drive, but that's not the point. The PS3 presentation was also mostly technical, but they only showed pre-rendered gameplay, and I think you understand where I'm going with this. The next generation processor became both literally and figuratively a stumbling block for Sony. First, the chip was developed in partnership with IBM and Toshiba, which cost absolutely massive amounts of money, though it wasn't made just for the console, but for other electronics too. It was supposed to become universal for PCs, TVs, servers, different equipment, and only then for consoles. But the engineers miscalculated a bit here. The processor might not be bad, even groundbreaking for its time. They even assembled clusters from dozens of PS3s to simulate black holes, and most amazingly, the cell processor handled this excellently. For such computational tasks, it was ideal, but for games, total failure. Or rather, maybe it would have been decent, but it all came down to architecture. The architecture turned out complex. Even Sony's internal studios didn't figure out what was what right away, and third-party developers didn't even want to dig into it, which made games look worse than on Xbox 360. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The main thing to remember, the processor might have been decent, but in practice they had to attach a weak graphics card from Nvidia, even by those standards, to make it work somehow. And that's another plus to the console's final cost, which by the way cost $500 in the base version or $600 in the top one. And that's adjusted for 2006. Accounting for inflation, that would be around $800 now, exactly the price of the PS5 Pro. See why I called these generations similar at the beginning? But the funny thing is different. Back then, the company was selling the console at a loss of about $250, so the PS3 cost Sony $850 to make, against the Xbox 360, which cost just $300. Yeah, Microsoft was also selling their console at a loss, plus they got stuck replacing consoles due to processor failures, but that's another story. Before reaching users and store shelves, the console itself gets to testers and game developers as dev kits. This is the first device that already looks like a console, though it isn't one yet, though not always visually either. The first PS3 kit looked like a regular mini PC. Many people had those under their monitors. Nevertheless, it could run unsigned code. Simply put, different games for testing and optimization for PS3 hardware. They were region-free, though actually not all. Even dev kits were for specific regions. And you can still find them for crazy amounts of money even now. Besides this box, there were more down-to-earth versions for developers, already looking like PS3s, but with Tool engraved under the name, Test, and other labels. The biggest problem for developers was exactly the cell architecture. They had to literally rewrite big chunks of their engines to make games work somehow on PS3. Many third-party studios simply refused such headaches, and PS3 ports were often made by other teams, which didn't help their quality. But the design thing was interesting too, because if rumors are true, engineers learned about the design the same way journalists did, at the presentation. And after that, to match the announced design, they had to literally cram hardware inside this case, which caused another problem: overheating. If Xbox 360 had the infamous red lights of death, the first PS3 had yellow light from overheating. The console could just suddenly shut down during a gaming session, with thermal paste replacement or anything else not helping. By the way, this reminds me of the PS5 situation, where supposedly designers and engineers also had a hard time making the console in a rush, resulting in the huge fat version dimensions. So in the Slim, they just removed extra cooling to make it smaller. Again, these are rumors, but if they're true, Sony clearly doesn't know how to learn from their mistakes. Another problem was that PS3 came out a year later than Xbox 360. Microsoft was already actively capturing the market and gamers' minds, while Sony was still messing around with their console production. But even though Xbox came out earlier, it was worse in many ways. And not just because of processor failures, those infamous red lights of death, but also because the first revisions didn't support HDMI and therefore couldn't output full HD images, while PS3 had HDMI from day one and 1080p picture quality, which forced Microsoft to add this connector in new versions. But at launch, it was still tough. Players were unhappy with the small number of games, developers unhappy with complex architecture, everyone unhappy with poor quality multi-platform games, which often looked worse on PS3 than Xbox 360, and this while the console itself cost more. But there were still arguments for buying it. First was backward compatibility with PS2, which had tons of cool games on a hardware level, meaning there was a separate board in the console, not software emulation like in later versions. And for the price of one console, you basically bought two. Geeks say it plays better that way, but I think most people didn't care. And second, this generation became the first with constant online, which is like normal for us, but back then mostly everyone played locally, and with the 7th generation's release, if you wanted to play with friends online, you had to get a console. You could say, well, there's Xbox, but first, by that time, everyone already knew they flew off to digital heaven pretty often. And second, online there, unlike PlayStation, was paid. Well, technically it's paid everywhere. But on PS3, you could play free games without a subscription, unlike Xbox. They fixed this in the new generation. But I remember even on Xbox One, you had to buy Live Gold to play Apex or Fortnite. However, even despite all this, PS3's start was pretty not great. And ultimately, just in the first couple years of sales, Sony lost $4.7 billion. But they didn't give up, and didn't shift financial responsibility to fans like they do now, releasing remasters to patch budget holes after failing live service games. Instead, they got together, thought about it, and decided to fix everything. Maybe this, respect for fans and the right approach, by 2009 allowed Sony to start gaining momentum again with the PS3 Slim release. The company began actively working with external studios and helping them master the complex cell architecture. By this time, even Sony's internal studios started understanding how to squeeze maximum from the console, leading to the first truly impressive exclusives. Unlike current Sony, the past one learned from their mistakes and released a console that was not only more technological, but also cheaper than the base version. Remember, PS5 Slim got more expensive compared to the fat version by $50, though it became smaller and cheaper to produce, but technically stayed the same. Like the hardware stayed the same, but due to time, production itself got cheaper. And everyone forgot about the semiconductor shortage. The second time, recently, price went up because of Trump's tariffs, which is understandable. But that first price increase raises questions. While PS3 went from $600 down to $300, this was a decisive step that many saw as the console's second launch. But they achieved this by removing hardware PS2 support from PS3. In Slim, they replaced it with software emulation, which allowed them to both cheapen the console and make it thinner. Though I don't think anyone noticed the difference in game launches. Generally, each revision used to have its specific task. For example, in the 7th generation, there was no Pro version at all. PS3 Slim came out in 2009 and became a real sales hit. It was cheaper, quieter, more energy efficient, and simply more reliable than the first model. And in 2012 came Super Slim, an even more compact version with a top drive cover that slid manually. This was done for even greater production cost reduction and consequently price. Each revision was released for its own tasks and at the right time, not like now when Pro versions come out just to make money from the most dedicated fans, or to test new PSSR technology on those willing to pay $800 for a testing period. Something else many forget when talking about PS3's revival. Hacking, in my opinion, it also played an important role in the console's popularization. After all, the first hacks appeared practically together with the first Slim's release in 2009. Back then, it was still possible to officially install Linux on PlayStation. Yes, those were the times. This was mainly done for different companies, like that cluster calculating black holes. But there were others too. And for such non-standard tasks, Sony allowed installing custom operating systems for cell processor computational tasks. Surprising how, with such an approach, the first hacks appeared only 3 years after the first console's release. Nevertheless, they closed this vulnerability in the next patch. pretty radically, simply cutting out Linux installation functionality and along the way throwing overboard everyone who bought the console for this function. But that's Sony, their care for fans in quotes, was already showing back then, though they had to pay a hefty sum in lawsuits for this, while pirates meanwhile found other ways. To put it briefly, they hacked literally everything from the drive, just throwing in its emulator, to memory overflow allowing developer mode launch, and there all doors are open. It wasn't done quickly. Sony meanwhile tried to throw obstacles every way they could, but ultimately gave up anyway. And now absolutely any PS3 revision can be modded, which, by the way, largely allows it to stay relevant even now, and back then it simply increased the audience base, because hacking worked normally, didn't crash the system, didn't lower frame rate in games, and most importantly, ran all games, even new ones. For those who don't know, currently on PS5 old firmware versions get hacked, while new games come out for current firmware, and you simply can't play them on old ones. Back then there were no such restrictions, and hacking PS3, you could play everything that came out. But the final chord in popularity's return was that by the console's midlife cycle, Sony finally started releasing those exclusives that are considered PlayStation classics today. The first Uncharted showed that PS3 could do beautiful graphics and cinematics. Killzone 2 became a technical masterpiece of its time, making many believe in the console's potential. Little Big Planet created a whole new genre, and Heavy Rain showed that games could be interactive cinema better than anything David Cage had made before. God of War 3 set a new level of epicness and bloody battles, while indie masterpiece Journey proved that not everything is measured by polygon count. It was during this period that Sony began forming what we know today as the signature PlayStation exclusive style: cinematic adventures with strong stories and charismatic heroes, sometimes decent platformers, beautiful racing games, and just awesome quality games. But PS3 wasn't living on exclusives alone. GTA 4 and later GTA 5 became real system sellers that many bought the console for. Interestingly, if GTA 4 on PS3 looked worse than on Xbox 360, by GTA 5 developers had already learned to squeeze maximum from cell architecture, and the difference was minimal, though still in Xbox's favor. And releases like Metal Gear Solid 4, Final Fantasy 13, and the Mass Effect series showed that major publishers also started taking PS3 seriously and investing in quality ports, though this was mainly influenced by the console's sales growth after all the mistake correction work. And toward the end of PS3's life cycle, it started getting simply phenomenal exclusives. Against the backdrop of amazing console discounts in stores, The Last of Us, which many consider the generation's best game, came out just a few months before PS4's launch. And this while the game technically squeezed everything possible and impossible from the console. Even now it looks stunning. Uncharted 3 finally secured Naughty Dog's status as one of the industry's best studios. Journey became real art house in the gaming world, where everyone looked for their sacred meaning, trying to guess what developers wanted to say. And after them came Beyond Two Souls, Gran Turismo 6, God of War Ascension. Generally, by that time, Sony already fully understood their audience and knew how to make exactly what fans needed: story-driven single-player games with excellent graphics and gameplay. This formula worked in the next generation too, but with PS5's release, something broke. The company increasingly started investing in live service games that failed one after another, and Concord became the final chord. Even the words are similar. After which management was replaced, and it seems PS5 is starting to gain momentum now. Ghost of Yoti is coming out, GTA 6 is expected this year, which, like GTA 4 and 5, many will buy PS5 for, or already bought. Though for such recovery, it took not 3 years but a whole 5, plus huge budgets the company is trying to recoup by porting all their games to PC, which was impossible to imagine in the 7th generation, and releasing several remasters for already new games. However, we've gotten distracted from the video's main topic. Interestingly, PS3 got real love and recognition only at the very end of its existence. Yeah, throughout its life, fans kept returning and leaving, for example because of the PSN hack when users' bank cards supposedly leaked online, and the service didn't work for about a month. And yet by 2013, PS3 finally overtook Xbox 360 in sales. Despite the competitor's year head start, players appreciated both the new game library, free multiplayer, and improved console stability. Today, many warmly remember exactly that console generation as the golden age of the gaming industry, when microtransactions weren't yet the norm, games came out finished, and developers weren't afraid to experiment with new ideas. But to be honest, people really started loving this console only now. There weren't as many PS3 videos even during its relevance. You could say YouTube was just starting then, but it already existed. I think such widespread interest is connected to two factors. First is banal nostalgia for the past. When we were all younger, time was carefree and much calmer, grass was greener, you get it. and second, how similar PS3 and PS5 are. After all, the console itself isn't bad, it was killed by wrong management, and now the company has all the cards to bring back universal love, especially when there are no competitors. After all, even during PS3's relevance, it managed to overcome a failed start and overtake Xbox 360 in sales. The console became a symbol of Sony's persistence and faith in their product. They didn't give up when everything was going badly, but continued improving both hardware and software ecosystem. Much of what we take for granted today started exactly on PS3. The first serious attempts at digital distribution, PSN's establishment as a platform, PlayStation Plus, which originally was just a nice bonus, not a mandatory subscription for online gaming. Even the idea that a console could be a media center for the whole family started exactly with PS3, with its Blu-ray drive and ability to watch video from USB drives. You could make a separate video about PS3 now, but what impressed me? The PS3 online store still works. Yes, many games disappeared from it, but nevertheless, it at least works, unlike Xbox 360. Plus, there's online in Call of Duty or FIFA. There was Battlefield until recently, but those servers are already shut down. However, on hacked consoles, there's still live online on fan servers, though there are already tons of cheaters, and playing with them is simply impossible. But for example, MotorStorm has online, Resistance is also alive, Warhawk seems possible too, but I haven't checked personally. Generally, surprisingly, even now there's live online here, and this somewhat motivated me to make a review of this already retro console in 2025, so if you want such a video, give me a like and comment under this video. Generally, PS3 started as a failed console, especially after PS2's unprecedented success. High price, complex architecture, and lack of hit games at launch practically buried the console, but Sony showed persistence, lowered the price, released the slim version, and improved relations with developers. By mid-life cycle, PS3 was already a worthy Xbox 360 competitor, and by the end, even surpassed it. From this story, Sony should have learned an important lesson. Don't overestimate technical specifications, and don't underestimate the importance of accessibility and game library content. And with PS4, everything worked perfectly. If you want the same kind of video where we analyze the whole generation from beginning to end, like this video. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And finally, is it worth buying PS3 in 2025? Honestly, yes, it's worth it, but with reservations. PS3 today is a time machine to an era when games were still made with soul and without greedy microtransactions. Yeah, there's already a working emulator allowing PS3 games to run even on Steam Deck. But here's the thing, no emulator will convey that atmosphere when you don't need to worry about graphics settings when you're holding an original DualShock 3 in your hands. And the menu looks like true art. If you miss those hits, today you can play them or even replay them. In my opinion, maybe again due to nostalgia, but from 2007 to 2012, the best games of all time came out. The first Assassin's Creeds, BioShocks, Mafia 2, cult Call of Duties, NFS games that hadn't declined yet, Portal, which even according to Gabe worked amazingly, Overlord, and many other games. Yes, you can play them on PC, yes, exclusives run through emulators, but purely by feel, exactly PS3 takes you back in time. Of course, many PS3 hits already got remasters and remakes on modern platforms, but they already need decent hardware. And there's a whole library of games that remained exclusives of that generation. So if you're a nostalgic gamer or just want to play something but don't have a decent PC, retro is worth trying. The main cool thing about this generation is that even 20 years later, you can go on YouTube or some forum and dig up an interesting game you'd never even heard of before. PS3's library is huge and diverse, from AAA hits to indie experiments. Tokyo Jungle, Folklore, 3D Game Heroes, Puppeteer. These games didn't become mega hits, but represent unique and interesting projects worth discovering even today. PS3 is largely a whole era in the gaming industry, an era of experiments, digital distribution establishment, and birth of many series we still love. And though it had a difficult start, ultimately it earned its place in history and players' hearts. And for Sony Company, it will remain as the console that almost destroyed it, but ultimately helped make the best generation, PS4, and so far not the best with PS5. Maybe modern Sony should remember this lesson. They still have time to turn a so-so console into a new legend. And that's all, friends. If you liked the video, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and write in comments how you like this format. See you next time.